Hey everyone, Armored Otter here. With the reveal that Ashes of Malmouth is going to drop in early October, I decided to take to the newly updated Grim tools to make a working list of all the new constellations and talk a little bit about each one. Starting with the Tier 1 constellations, the Toad, which is a purple or ascendant constellation, gives a strong mix of survivability in the form of health, vitality resistance, and attack damage converted to health, and offensive stats with offensive ability and spirit. The final node boosts your Aether and Vitality damage, as well as giving you flat Aether and Vitality damage for your auto attacks. This is a great starting constellation for a budding Necromancer who aims to make use of the weapon pool skills. The Quill, which is a green or Eldritch constellation, boosts the player's elemental damage and gives small, flat elemental damage boost to basic attacks. It also grants general use stats like health, energy, and defensive ability. Much like the Toad is aimed at fledgling Necromancers, this is a great starter constellation for the Inquisitor, who uses guns and basic attacks to trigger weapon pool skills. The Wretch falls under the Red or Chaos constellations, and supports an interesting type combination in the form of poison and chaos damage. I'd be interested in seeing what kind of new occultist-centered builds arise if this type combination is more supported in items and other constellations. The first thing that comes to mind is the Abomination constellation, which would be a powerful endgame devotion in the right build that supports both chaos and poison in tandem, instead of one or the other. The Stagg is a gold or order constellation that supports physical and bleed damage builds, as well as offering health, defensive ability, and pierce resistance. I don't really see this as a good early game devotion in a world where Falcon does everything this constellation does, while also giving you a super powerful on-hit ability. Stagg could find its way into Soldier and Shaman builds as filler while building up to better constellations. Moving on to the Tier 2 constellations, we have a ton of cool stuff that will really open up some awesome builds. But let's start with something not so awesome. The Staff of Ratash is a pet-centric constellation that gives players and pets a bunch of survivability stats with a little bit of offense mixed in. The players get a boost to Aether damage as well as a nice little chunk of offensive ability. But the real selling point of this constellation is the crit chance and crit damage for pets. In the end, this might be a good constellation, but I don't really see it making any waves. Typhos, Jailer of Souls, is just a well-rounded, decent constellation for Necromancers. Players and pet alike will enjoy a grab bag of resistances, and much like the Toad before it, this constellation gives a healthy amount of Aether and Vitality damage. I think it's worth saying that while pets probably won't be the focus of an Aether Vitality Necromancer, the pet bonuses will most likely not be lost, as they may use Reap Spirit, which will summon a cool little ghosty. The Bard's Harp is a really cool constellation that seems to be thematically tailored for Inquisitors, but will likely end up being great for a large number of builds. This constellation offers big bonuses to health, energy, and a large variety of resistances, while supporting pierce and elemental damage. The final node grants a powerful ability that you can tack onto your auras and self-buffs. It gives you a chance when struck, so you have to be in the thick of things taking some hits, to ring out with a magical song that restores faith to your allies and yourself. You instantly get a quarter of your energy restored and get a slew of offensive and defensive ability. While the defensive and offensive ability buffs are the main selling point of this constellation, the energy restored will be vital for energy-hungry builds. This constellation is probably strong enough for solo play, but it will really shine in groups. Murmur, Mistress of Rumors, is a really cool constellation that my new Acid and Cold Reaper is going to love. Cold and Acid is a combination that's really cool and also really underexplored, but this constellation will definitely put it on the map. The stats alone make this constellation worth considering, with a bunch of Cold and Acid support, a chunk of health, and a metric ton of defensive ability. But the superstar of this constellation is definitely the ability node. Rumor is a damage over time ability that will jump from enemy to enemy, shredding cold and acid resistance and lowering offensive ability. With the new disparity in offensive ability in your opponents and your metric ton of defensive ability from the constellation, your character will be really tough to hit and nigh on impossible to crit. In short, this devotion is super strong and is likely worth building around. Eladra's Phoenix is one of my favorite new devotions, and for very good reasons. This is a very offensive-oriented devotion, with the only real defensive stats it offers are a pittance of health and resistances. but it really heaps on the fire, aether, and critical damage. The ability tied to this devotion is nothing short of crazy. If you watched my video where I talked about the new devotions they teased in Grim Misadventures, I went absolutely gaga for this ability. How it works is, whenever you crit with the ability linked to Elijah's Phoenix, you trigger a powerful aura that burns enemies near you with aether and fire damage. The real kicker here is that it also grants you flat damage absorption. It's hard to put into words how strong flat damage absorption is. With this triggered, you will be able to negate most damage from big mobs of enemies and shrug off noticeable damage from even the worst of bosses. Imagine, if you will, walking around with a mini blast shield that can trigger at any time. On top of all that, it has a 7-second duration with a 12-second cooldown. If you can reliably crit, you will have access to that damage absorption more often than not. This constellation alone will likely put Kalidor's Tempest on the map as one of the strongest builds, and will likely be considered by any other build who uses either aether or fire damage. Finally, we have the big boys, the whole enchiladas, the tier 3 constellations. Ishtak Spring Maiden is a huge defensive powerhouse for pet users. The constellation as a whole grants a whopping 700 health, as well as a mishmash of resistances for both pet and player. The ability atop Ishtak is a circuit breaker that triggers at 50% health, giving the player 30% damage absorb, while beefing up all your pets and forcing the aggro onto them. This is a very robust constellation that will make the player very hard to kill, but I don't see it being all that powerful. Generally, if you go for a tier 3 constellation, you want it to have an ability that really synergizes with your core damage type, instead of simply helping you last longer. Vyre, the Stone Matron, is the end-all be-all for tanking constellations. Vyre can send any beefy character over the top with heaps of health, armor, and resistances, and she even has a node that gives 80% physical and trauma damage. The ability from this constellation is very powerful, and it has an awesome animation. Every time your character gets hit, there's a 20% chance that you will summon a large stone fist at their feet, bashing them, and then turning them into stone for good measure. While it only has a 2.5 meter radius, the skill itself has a measly 1 second cooldown. If you wade your guy into the middle of everything, this thing will trigger non-stop, crowd controlling large sections of enemies at any given time. The stun is definitely the biggest selling point of this skill, but it's no slouch in damage either. With proper investment into physical and trauma damage, the Fist of Vyre should have no trouble clearing out smaller enemies, complementing single target builds like Cadence or Savagery very well. The Hand of Altos gets my vote for the strongest constellation in the game. The stats it offers are really quite nice, giving a hefty 70 total offensive ability as well as a huge bonus to lightning and electrocute damage. It also gives a ton of cold damage, but that seems kind of out of place. But who knows, maybe shamans will be using Wind Devil in conjunction with this, or maybe this might be the boon Trozan's Sky Shards needs to be competitive. The proc on this thing is absolutely ridiculous. 100% chance on critical strike, which shamans and arcanists do all the time. You send out a chain lightning that hits up to 10 targets, stunning them briefly and shredding a whopping 33% resistances, all on a 1.5 second cooldown. It's my personal opinion that any build that can abuse this constellation will be insane. Ratash, the Veil Warden, is another one of those Aether and Vitality constellations, giving big bonuses to those damage types sprinkled with some pet benefits and defensive stats. The proc is a 15% chance an attack to mark your target, dealing flat Aether and Vitality damage while also shredding Vitality and Life Drain resistances. This could be pretty powerful on a skill like Drain Essence, which probably deals damage very quickly and affects multiple targets. It's also worth mentioning that almost every Necromancer pet has some form of Vitality damage, which could be the real power of this skill. I must admit that it's a little disappointing for me that all these pet skills are bundled with the Aether Vitality package, which makes it seem like a petless Necromancer won't have too much support, and might suffer in viability. The final tier 3 constellation is Atak Saru, the Mirage. Atak Saru is an Aether and Elemental focused constellation that gives a reasonable boost to pierce and bleeding resistance as well as health, but also grants a very hefty amount of defensive ability. I think one of the coolest things about this constellation is that it's not clear-cut exactly what build this is tailored for. Of course, Arcanist builds that focus on Panetti's replicating missile are going to love this, as well as Kalidor's Tempest and unmodified Alberic's Ether Ray. But even elemental builds that don't have an Aether damage secondary might find this useful, like Elemental Cadence Soldier or Inquisitor builds. The ability itself seems to be very strong. It's a 15% chance on attack to summon a rune for 3 seconds that continuously fires wave after wave of Aether elemental magic. If attached to a skill that deals damage rapidly, like Alberic's Ether Ray, or hits multiple targets like Panetti's or Kalidor's, you should be able to summon a rune on cooldown, which is only 1 second. With an efficient build, you should have 2 or 3 runes summoned at any given time, which would absolutely devastate enemies in almost any scenario. Well, that's all the new constellations coming your way in Ashes of Malmouth. Tell me, do you think I'm off base in judging the power level or relative usefulness of any of these constellations? Which constellations are you most excited to try? Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.